human life were really invaluable, no one would ever drive a car, right? Because you know that every time you get in a car rather than going on a bus, you're like dramatically increasing the chances that you die, right? Because cars are much more dangerous than buses are, and buses are much more dangerous than trains are, right? And you clearly do that in order to save some time. And of course, time is money. I think if you've gotten this far in economics, you believe that. So then you've got to think that life is money too, right? So clearly people make trade-offs about the risks in their lives, and if we as a society are going to make decisions, we better be making trade-offs that are similar to the trade-offs that individuals are choosing to make, or we're going to make very silly decisions, right? But one quite, well, maybe troubling conclusion that you have to come to if you start thinking about the value of human life is you have to note that rich people are going to be willing to spend a lot more to preserve their lives than poor people are, both because they just have more money to spend on it, but also because at some point there's not that much to do with your money anymore, except to try to extend your life, right? Because if you have declining marginal utility of spending money on stuff, you run out of fancy cars to buy and so forth, you might as well extend the amount of time you have to enjoy all those fancy cars that you're buying, right? And that means that a rich person's life has to be worth more than a poor person's life. Now that sounds terrible to a lot of people, but the truth is that we let rich people buy more of all sorts of things. We let them buy more fancy cars, we let them buy more comfortable houses and nicer dinners, and honestly, more attractive members of the opposite gender to live with. And yet, it would be a little bit crazy to then say they can't also buy more life, and we know that they do. And there's other areas of life where people say, oh, rich shouldn't be allowed to have more of that, like influence on political decisions. Not so clear that that's not just one more area where we, the rich having more of some things can be traded off for them having more of other things. And the poor might actually be better off in that situation because they could get more of the material things that they want in exchange for having less influence on political decisions. So, yeah, go ahead.
Couldn't you argue that because a less wealthy person's, more of their actions are for the purpose of extending their life rather than for, other things, like taking a vacation is not necessarily something that would extend your life?
Yeah.
That their value of extending their life compared to their value of a dollar is higher than that of a rich person?
Why do you think that more poor people do more things to try to extend their life? I don't think that that's empirically.
If that were true.
Well, I mean, it's possible, but I just think as a matter of fact, that ain't true. I mean, the truth is that the rich work out more than people who don't, even though their time is more valuable, so they're spending more than proportionately more on that. They spend more on medicine, they get fancier health insurance. I mean,
food.
They have more nutritious food, they usually eat better. I mean, there's all sorts of dimensions along which the rich are making more investments in their health than the poor are.
But conceptually, that logic comes from a proportion of their income and not necessarily more.
Well, I think it's even more than proportional because if they're spending more time working out, the poor's time working out is cheaper than the rich's time working out is because they earn a lower wage with that time, right? And so the rich people must put a very high value on their life to be willing to work out more, even though their time is so valuable. Right? Okay, go ahead, David.
Well, kind of to add on that, I think
Yeah.
maybe something that may help that point is to
Yeah.
since a poor person is trying to maybe doesn't have that time to work out, right? Because he's working more hours in order to maximize his income in order to survive.
Yeah.
So in that sense.
Well, I think that's true. I think one reason why the poor invest less in preserving their lives is they're much more likely to die from something else. So Emily Oster did a very controversial study on AIDS in Africa in which she found that your income had a huge effect on basically whether you were likely to wear a condom or not. And her basic calculation was, well, if you're likely to die from some other disease or be killed by one of your neighbors at some point, it doesn't make that much sense to worry about whether you get AIDS or not. Go ahead, Kit.
I was just
saying that, I mean, just because like rich people usually can buy more and better things than our brothers, that's not exactly like a moral calculus, so like.
No, I agree, but we'll talk later about, I mean, you may want to redistribute wealth. I support a lot of redistribution of wealth. You heard me playing the Internationale the other day, right? But once you have redistributed wealth, why not let people with their wealth do what they want? I mean, you have to say why it would be the case that you would want to let people spend that wealth that they have on certain things and not other things. You know, why don't we allow people to buy as much influence as they want in elections, but then say you have to have absolute equality, everyone has to eat the exact same meal every day, right? Or why don't we let them, you know, spend a ton on their health, you know, and have the rich will live a lot longer, but why don't we make everyone have exactly the same education? Why do we have like equality in some areas and not equality in other areas? It's a little bit weird. Okay, so yeah, go ahead, Connor.
You could potentially argue for equality there to prevent from overpopulation from harming us in the future.
I mean, in health.
Yeah.
Well, I would think if you want to keep overpopulation from harming you, you'd want to make something that we currently insist on equality in much less equal. I think that you would, I mean, eugenics is something that like absolutely is verboten in American political discourse. It wasn't always that way. And it's not obvious that if you want to have equality of opportunity, that it makes sense to just allow anyone to be having kids anytime they want. So, if you want to go down that road, you can give yourself even more trouble. But I'm happy to go there. In fact, we were talking about eugenics in office hours last night. I don't know if anyone was there. Okay, so 3 categories must be measured to do this. Is you have to figure out, first of all, what is the value of human life per unit of probability of dying, basically. So, you know, if we try to say, how much would you be willing to pay to avoid yourself dying for sure, it's sort of a silly question because you don't have any time to enjoy your wealth if you're going to die for sure, right? So saving money is not going to be worth very much to you. But if it's like for a 1% probability of dying, then that doesn't affect the value of the money in the state where you don't die very much, and so you can use that to value what people put on a chance of dying. A second thing is the value of other types of injuries other than, you know, death, like diseases or disabilities. And then you have to try to extrapolate this to people of different income levels, because obviously, as I said, you know, wealthier people are going to be willing to pay more to extend their lives. And the estimates have been that the income elasticity of life with respect to income is about 0.6 to 0.8. Now that's inconsistent with what we were saying, which is that the rich would be willing to spend more than proportionately more. I think that they are, so I'm skeptical of these estimates, but let's just take them for granted right now. And you'll see sort of how sketchy the methods that were used to arrive at these things were and why it's not implausible that this thing is way off. The thing that's amazing about the value of human life is one of the most fundamental parameters in economics. It's something that's used all over the government and set just as if we just knew the value that it came from God or something like that. And yet, you'll see it's the methodology that's actually used to arrive at it is pretty darn problematic. So, okay, the usual approach to measuring this is, first, assume that the value of life depends on being alive and not being alive, and not on how you die. So this basically says that you don't mind whether you're tortured to death or whether, you know, you die from, natural causes or you die from a lethal injection. They're all equally valuable to you. And that's sort of going to be, as you'll see, the basis of, that's a key assumption that goes into a lot of stuff. Second is that you have to look for cases when people make trade-offs between something that's less risky and something that's more risky. Like deciding whether to take a dangerous job like mining, where you might be crushed, right? Or deciding on how safe of a car to purchase. Then you say that the price differential between the safe and the risky option is a measure of the willingness of people to pay to do one job versus the other. And to do that, there's a key assumption, which is that the only thing that differs between those two things, you have to be able to hold everything else constant. The only thing that differs is how risky the job is. And then that will tell you how much the marginal person, the person who's just indifferent between doing the two jobs, values their life. But of course, it won't tell you how much inframarginal people value it. And in fact, it won't even tell you what the marginal person values it. It will just tell you what sort of the average marginal person values this. Right? So, this is obviously pretty problematic in a whole bunch of ways, because you're going to have to assume that everyone other than the marginal person is exactly the same in terms of their value of life as the marginal person to get any sort of predictive power out of this, right? And of course, you would think that people who are like very happy to be coal miners and would never consider doing anything else probably are putting less value on their life than people who would never consider being coal miners because it's so dangerous, right? So there's a sort of gross assumption that's being made here. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
So how do you know that that marginal willingness to pay is kind of not dominated by an income effect?
You mean like why are the people are in that job because they're poor?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly the problem.
Oh.
I mean, I'm trying to show you what the problem with all these things are. So like, we're inferring the value of life from what the marginal person is willing to pay for this.
Okay.
And that might not be at all reflective of what inframarginal people are willing to pay. I mean, there's all sorts of things that could differ between those marginal people and other people, right?
Yeah.
So this is the crazy, incredibly rough, but only way we have to study the statistical value of human life. It probably gets us a more accurate measure than just looking at how much money someone makes during their life as a measure of the value of their life. But it's not clear that it's enormously better than that. We then extrapolate from this using an income elasticity, which is calculated by looking at this in a rich country and looking at it in a poor country, and then just assuming that all of the difference is determined by income, not by culture, not by place, not by the different nature of the jobs, not by any of that, or the fact that you might die in a different way. And therefore getting some number like 0.6 to 0.8, and then you just extrapolate. So that's the basis of what the government uses to determine all sorts of regulations that it puts in all over the economy. Now, does that sound crazy? It sounds pretty darn crazy. But the alternative is to have totally inconsistent and therefore wasteful policies. So if you don't have some threshold here, you know, someone could say, oh, statistical value of human life is really, really high. You should put in this regulation that costs $50 million to save a life. And another person could say, oh, no, it's really low. You should put in this regulation that costs only $1,000 to save a life. What seems clear is no matter what the value of human life is, there's sort of some things that are clearly on one side of the threshold, some things that are clearly on the other side. The number we're going to get here is going to be somewhere like between 5 and 8 million. I think the real way you should think about it is really somewhere between 1 and 20 million or something like that. And the things that are clearly outside of that range clearly fall on one side, and other stuff is more ambiguous and sort of, even though we won't get that stuff right, it's less important to get it right because it's less clearly in one direction or the other. Okay, so let's see a simple example of how this works. So imagine that every year, 3 out of 2,000 coal miners in a particular coal mine die. And suppose the factory workers have comparable skills and that the job is comparably pleasant to do. Now imagine that only 1 out of every 2,000 factory workers dies every year, and imagine that the coal mine pays $4,000 more per year, right? Now let's assume that the only relevant difference from the job is the risk. The difference in the chances of dying between these two jobs is 1 in 1,000, right? So in exchange, you get $4,000, and so that gives us the human life is worth $4 million. That's basically the idea. And the real calculations that people do are dressed up with all sorts of econometrics and